Hi, I'm Jimmy Hendrix, and welcome to the Shadowsoft podcast. Today, we'll be interviewing Derrick Sutherland around Kubernetes, containers, and all things microservices that are happening nowadays. Derrick, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, this is Derrick Sutherland. I'm a practice manager at Shadowsoft. My focus is across everything from software development to cybersecurity, both as it relates to how you make your applications into microservice architectures and keep them safe, as well as how you containerize them and have them operate in an orchestration platform.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, Derrick. Um, with that, I'd like to kind of dive into a couple of initial questions that I've had around some curiosity regarding the container and kind of microservices movement. So, why do you think we're seeing so much momentum around microservices architecture, container adoption? And why do you think we're seeing so much momentum around the adoption of Kubernetes around that too?
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question to a certain degree. I think that some people are looking to see how the world is going to evolve, especially in times of where you don't have reliability engineers available, or where you're going to have opportunities to have applications that need to scale out because of workloads and you're trying to save cost consumption. Containers typically try and lead into a conversation of people think just isolation, but what I traditionally think of, especially in regards to orchestration models, is how well do we scale and recover in situations where the load is becoming something different than what we're traditionally expecting, either when we're having to downsize because there's less of a load, or extend out our capabilities because there's a greater size load, if that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. I mean, I would suppose then the kind of follow up to that for me, I've definitely realized that there's some unique advantages from an architecture standpoint, and portability. But do you really feel like the efficiencies that containers, or at least the origins of containers promised and microservices, are really fully realized in the market right now? Or um,
No, definitely not. I think number one, there's a lot of organizations, not just ones that we work with, but there's plenty of organizations out there that are still operating in either a monolith or even as simple as a SOA based application that's just not quite where they want to be. I think some organizations think, hey, our application is functioning and operating appropriately. And the reality is everything is fine until something goes wrong, right? When you end up in a situation where things start hitting the fan and we start having opportunities where applications aren't performing the way we expecting, and then we have to go back and readdress how things are built. So, I mean, just to talk about that from like a general high level perspective, there's a lot of organizations that we traditionally deal with that they're funded in such a way that they're trying to get a capability out to their customer first. And thinking about scalability isn't necessarily a feature function. It's more about sustainability at that point, right? So I feel like a lot of customers are really more about what feature am I going to get out to my customer next? And it's not until something goes wrong that they start looking at risk mitigation of either a security principle, something that's going wrong in that arena, or more specifically in terms of containers, how are we not scaling or recovering from a fault type situation in a way that makes sense to our customers so they don't notice any downtime?
yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. I think that there's definitely a lot of capture to be had as far as like capitalizing on what containers can really do for organizations. In all actuality, you're totally on the money in terms of what I see in the market is that a lot of organizations aren't set up currently to really fully leverage all the efficiencies, but there's still benefits that can be derived from moving to this type of architecture and management. Which kind of brings me to my next question. Really is, a lot of the things you said are very beneficial from an operational standpoint in terms of level of service, for application delivery and for the customer end. But in regards to developers, we're seeing a lot of developers really popularize and advocate, or I guess you could even say evangelize for Kubernetes. And from my understanding, that makes sense. in terms of the benefits that it delivers developers, in terms of breaking up their applications and allowing development to happen in a more iterative fashion and a more stable fashion, I guess more portable fashion too. But how do you feel, given your background, specifically, how does Kubernetes really benefit developers in terms of strategy?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of benefiting or not. It depends on how you look at it, right? It benefits it if you come out the gate with it. If you're coming to the party late, you've already built your app and you want to go put it on there, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It's not a bad idea as long as you're willing to make the changes to your application so that way you start adopting the capabilities that Kubernetes gives you the advantage of, right? Versus if you start from the ground up and you're greenfielding an application, then it makes a lot more sense traditionally. The reason why there's a little bit of a separation there is, again, going back to like even a traditional SOA application or a monolith. In some instances, could you put a monolithic application into a container and shove it in Kubernetes? Sure. But when it starts getting replicated and horizontally scaled, how are you dealing with the caching of data between server instances? Are you just doing round robin from a load balancer and saying, hey, we're just going to have sticky sessions for what initial application you originally connected to? Because if that's the case, the only thing you're really getting as a benefit is fault tolerance. You're not really getting any of the benefits from a scalability perspective when it costs to cost consumption and saving overall your money. Now, if you do decide that you want to make that jump and you've already built your application, what it does for you is it starts forcing you to rebuild your application in the areas in which you've maybe misdesigned it from a scalability perspective. Have we integrated some kind of database versioning control system so we can roll out new databases behind Kubernetes? Are we using caching mechanisms where it makes sense? Are we using thread locks properly? Are we making sure that data is getting managed throughout individual service components so that way everything's aware all the time of what's going on? You know, having them operate in a stateless fashion. That's not going to be an overnight fix, but it is going to change the dynamic of how you do business and ultimately lend you more to being stable in the long run.
Yes, I mean, essentially, it kind of answers one of the other questions I had. You know, one of the criticisms around containers, microservices, Kubernetes in general is that, you know, it can make applications and app dev, you know, too complex, which I disagree with pretty flatly. But from your explanation, that really answers it. That it's not necessarily that it's inherently too complex or it's too hard to understand or deploy. It's that, you know, if you've already established your application and built it, it's not that it's impossible or even inefficient to leverage something like Kubernetes. It's just a tougher hill to climb. As you said, you know, with greenfield applications, starting from scratch and building around that, it's great. But there are benefits to be derived if you were to adopt something like a container strategy in Kubernetes, even with pre-built applications or existing, you know, technical debt, because, like you said, it forces organizations to reorganize themselves and components of the application to work more efficiently in today's modern environment, especially with regards to infrastructure and modern application architectures. So
yeah, and I think people get stuck on the whole complexity thing. They think that because there's new things you have to do, that immediately means it's more complex. The reality is it's not more complex, generically speaking. It's more, there's more things you need to be considering, which you should have considered in the first place. It's not that application development is more complex. It's that ultimately it was always this complex. You just were kind of skipping the rails to get feature functionality out there first, rather than focus on the things that you should have been focusing on from a stability perspective to make your applications scale out the way they should. Now, there are some areas where you could argue maybe there's more complexity, which is, hey, the more instances of an application or service you throw out there, the more areas there are to diagnose when something goes wrong. But I feel like that's a second topic that's separate from how you build your application. We're not introducing complexity. We're making sure you're doing the right things from the ground up by introducing constraints that force you to do the right thing first.
yeah, I mean, I think that's really the biggest benefit in my mind is, again, enforcing or kind of providing some sort of influential structure to organizations to kind of, in my opinion, or I'd say to like get with the times, to fully leverage the technology that's available to them. So, you know, with that, it kind of leads me into another curiosity I've had around the influence that, something like Kubernetes can have on an organization, and kind of the unique drivers it can have with its adoption outside of just development practices is helping, like, for example, organizations becoming more DevOps centric, or providing beneficial process or strategic changes to an organization. What's your opinion on that?
Just to reiterate, to make sure I understand what you're asking how does it benefit DevOps in an organization from an instance of how they implement a DevOps strategy, or
how do you feel that Kubernetes and containers can have on influencing organizations to create strategic or beneficial process changes, DevOps being one of those types of process or cultural changes?
Well, I don't know about so much of a cultural change aspect to it, although it can be. It depends on how your applications are built. It depends on how your infrastructure is built. Most people, traditionally speaking, are doing the old configuration management type pattern of how they keep things in check. Now, if we're talking about automation as it relates to DevOps, then this applies, obviously, right? Because when you start moving into a Kubernetes world, things don't operate in the instance of having to keep things in a given state, because things are locked into a given state by nature of the way containers operate. So at this point, go ahead.
Yeah, just like, Kubernetes is designed to work in a immutable infrastructure kind of way, where there's a desired, at least my understanding, there's a desired state of infrastructure, and that it's immutable, and that it can't be changed. It has to be blown away and reinstated.
And that's where the cultural change comes, right? It's not really a culture change, because when I think culture, I think people, persons, how we feel and interact with each other. But what it changes is the way you think about how you're going to set up your infrastructure so that it stays stable, right? If you're used to the old paradigm of we have to have something checking in every so often because we're using Puppet or Chef, or Ansible in regards to how we automate our lifecycle for how infrastructure remains active inside of an environment and stable, this is going to be a mind shift. And that's really the best way I would classify it, is it's really less of a culture shift and more of a mind shift on how you're going to architect your solutions and how they're ultimately going to scale out and be independent of one another as they grow. I don't know if that makes sense to what you're asking, but that's the way that I would read it or intercept that question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. And that kind of really leads into more along the lines of another question for me is in regards to consumption, right? So when I say consumption, like how internal teams, if it's an intercompany or intra-company application, or if it's a customer-facing application, specifically in this example, kind of giving you a customer-facing approach with how people consume media or content, right? From applications like Netflix, or booking flights through Delta, or Black Friday on Amazon, right? How do you feel Kubernetes and containers have made like an impact on today's world from an application perspective to handle that type of consumption? Do you feel like it's something that is necessary for organizations to adopt eventually if they want to keep up with today's tech hungry world?
Necessary is one thing. I wouldn't say it's necessary. I would say it would be, they would be silly to not adopt something like a container orchestration platform like Kubernetes. The reason I say it that way, though, and it's not quote unquote necessary, is because organizations today are already doing this. And I don't mean they're already doing containers. They're already keeping up with the demand of these types of organizations without a container strategy. The problem that they're running into, though, is a couple of things. One, they're not as quickly to automatically react when something happens. So it means they're going to have less customer retention by ultimately, peeing off their customers for not being able to respond the way that their customer expects them to. Like Netflix, you never even know when a service goes out of. And I'll give you an example of this. In Netflix, the recommendations that show up on the actual individual videos that say, oh, since you like this, you might like this. When that service goes down, you're not even aware of it. They've engineered their platform that it just doesn't show that statement. It doesn't show that recommendation. Instead, it shows you some other kind of data. They've built their system in such a way that the end user never knows when something is going wrong. They just keep using the platform as if everything is honky-dory. Now, in the instance of I'm a different competitor and I'm trying to compete in that space, I can operate and try and compete. But the two areas I'm going to really stumble in if I'm not implementing some kind of microservice and container level orchestration based platform is number one, what does my cost model look like? Am I just going to always be scaled up so high that I never have to worry about customer demand, in which case I'm eating costs that I should never have to eat? And number two, am I automatically reactive enough to handle problems when they show up?
I think that those are really the two areas that I'm concerned with, at least from my standpoint as a solution architect, is, infrastructure in terms of consumption costs. As more organizations move to or strive to move towards cloud nativity. Public cloud like AWS, for example, it costs money to run, and consumption of resources can get astronomically expensive for some organizations if it's not managed properly. And the second part around kind of the ability to scale and also deal with fault tolerance and self-healing are things that I feel are pretty important. Again, today's world, from even an intra-company perspective, not even just a customer facing, I think that our attitudes have adjusted over time to be more in the now and immediate, and have immediate satisfaction. If there's any sort of delay of service, we take that pretty personally. So in my mind, Kubernetes helps organizations move, if employed correctly, right? Obviously it's down to development, but employed correctly could help organizations move to a strategy and an underlying infrastructure and architecture that would allow them to kind of protect themselves against some of the more harsh whims of our society when it comes to consumption and the culture of now. I understand that's kind of a broad or maybe loaded question, given we're talking about society and this interaction with a piece of technology, but it's definitely something I'm curious about. I guess moving more specific for yourself, and going back to that point about cloud nativity for organizations, we're seeing a lot of discussions around becoming cloud native or distributed infrastructures, namely in the hybrid kind of category of a lot of organizations are moving off of their colos or on-prem and into the cloud. Some are even going whole cloud. But to maximize the use of that infrastructure, there's a lot of things organizations have to do. And some of that comes down to even retooling how their applications are deployed and workloads are ran. Do you feel like Kubernetes can help organizations become more cloud native?
I don't know about cloud native specifically. What I will say, though, is this: Kubernetes is the standard, right? It's a standard for what we're using from a container orchestration perspective. And so since everyone is using it, you have AKS in Azure, you have EKS in AWS, you have GKE. They're all doing the exact same thing. What it enables you to do is, if you're going to consider, which you should, a container orchestration strategy, if you adopt Kubernetes in general, you're setting yourself up for success, at least to some degree, as it pertains to remaining cloud agnostic, right? Now, when I think cloud native, though, I typically think what's native specifically to one individual cloud provider. When you're talking about it, I'm guessing you more mean, though, what makes it cloud native in the essence of it's leveraging cloud native tooling in general, not specifically cloud native tooling towards AWS or Azure or whatever it is that you decide to select.
Yeah, I guess that wasn't really fair of me to just say cloud native in general.
No, yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
I guess, yeah. What I mean by that is being able to either take a strong step in the right direction to maximize use of these technologies and kind of the advantages they derive, right, from a high availability standpoint to being distributed and available worldwide if you need to, as well as some of the tools and architectural benefits and uniqueness that the cloud can bring. So I feel like, in my opinion, without being tied to any specific cloud provider, I feel like Kubernetes helps organizations get there a little bit faster if they're able to organize around it, especially going back to earlier in our conversation, if they're doing this in a greenfield way, or they have the time and resources to re-architect and refactor to get there. Which kind of brings me to another point that I've always I wouldn't say always, but I have some genuine curiosity around is, is Kubernetes truly better than existing architectures, or are there situations where Kubernetes and microservices don't make sense or really don't make things better? What's your opinion around that, or knowledge around that?
I'll say this. There are situations where using containers doesn't make sense. For an example, you're not going to throw Active Directory inside of a container. Why? Number one, it's a stateful application. Number two, it's not designed for that. Number three, it's a Windows-based application, which, yes, there are Windows containers, but let's all be fair. Windows containers aren't quite to where Linux containers are at this point. But
and we can all agree there.
Right. But, strategy-wise, it doesn't make sense to take something like that and throw it into there. But could you? Sure. You could take an LDAP server and throw it into a container. I just don't know if it makes sense, because the whole benefit of containerizing your application, well, I shouldn't say the whole, but a large benefit, is for the ability to horizontally scale. And you're not going to throw an LDAP server in HA using containers, at least as it stands today. Could that change in the future? Maybe. Who knows? Maybe things will get redesigned and they'll make more sense for that kind of a parameter of design. Now, in regards to traditional applications, are there times in which you wouldn't want to leverage microservices? I guess maybe if your application is so small that microservices doesn't make sense because all you are is providing a single base service. But at that point, you'd still want to horizontally scale, right? So from an application design perspective, really the question is there a situation in which you're making an application that doesn't belong in a container, that doesn't belong inside of an orchestration platform? I would say the applications that need to go in there first are stateless applications, because you don't have to worry about persistent storage. They're typically built natively with some kind of caching mechanism so they can intercommunicate with each other. But I would say if you're going to take a stateful, monolithic, fat application and shove it into a container and put it inside of Kubernetes, you're not going to really gain any benefits from it, except for the fact that, okay, now we're starting to get ourselves comfortable with this tooling for Kubernetes and how it operates. Now let's slowly retool our actual application so it leverages this platform properly. If you use it as a segue to changing something, then I think it's always appropriate. But if you leave a stateful application that's monolithic the way it was when you shoved it in there, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're adding extra toolage for what I would say is probably no benefit to you unless you re-architect.
So yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, that there's very few use cases or scenarios where it doesn't really make sense. It's more, no matter what, if you're leveraging it, you have the ability to get benefits out of it if you do the work to get there. So like you said, you can stick a monolithic stateful application, a fat application inside of a container. But if you don't start making efforts to re-architect that application to leverage Kubernetes in a more native way, to realize those benefits that it can deliver you, then you're really not doing yourself any favors other than giving yourself maybe the ability to scale a little bit better. And even then, like you said, you can still run into some issues if you're not leveraging or learning how to leverage Kubernetes in a more effective and efficient fashion.
Well, right. I mean, let's say you still have a monolithic app into there, and for your load balancer, you don't turn on sticky sessions. You just let traffic go wherever you want inside of Kubernetes, right? Now you're going to have drop session connections every time it switches from one version of the app to another that's being load balanced in the cluster. So there's concessions you'd have to make in those situations. And really what it would be about is we want to enable our infrastructure guys to start learning Kubernetes as we slowly migrate our old app to a new stateless app that works more fluently in this kind of an environment. That's really what that use case would be at that point.
Well, that's kind of the next questions that I have for you around Kubernetes would be kind of some of the more controversial topics around it. At least some of the debate that I've seen, there's people that fall into two camps, I'd say here. One is, Kubernetes is easy to deploy, it's easy to get and understand and learn. And there's other folks who, I maybe fall into the second camp, not wholly, but more just from a realistic standpoint, that despite it being pretty comprehensive and an incredible benefit and technology to our society, it can be complex. It can require a lot of learning and self-management, which can be pretty cumbersome or burdensome for some organizations or individuals. What's kind of your opinion around that?
I know this is going to sound stupid, but can you partially repeat the question? Just the last little bit of it.
No problem. Yeah, so really the last part of the question's around, there's some people that say that Kubernetes is complex and that it requires a lot of learning or has a steep learning curve and it requires a lot of self-management. Do you feel like that's accurate, inaccurate, or kind of a little column A, a little column B?
I think it's fair. I think it's a fair thing to say. Do I think it's an accurate thing to say all the time? No. What I will say is if you're going to take Kubernetes and you're going to try and deploy it in your data center, and you're not going to leverage operators for handling different things, you really want to do a do-it-yourself model, it's going to be complicated. It's going to be really complicated and it's going to be a pain in the butt, especially if you have to reconfigure custom networking features and components and add your own storage providers and things like that. Once you start getting into the weeds of how you have to do all these little individual pieces, it's going to get complicated fast. That doesn't mean it's insurmountable, but it's complicated. In opposition to that, if you leverage a tool that's built cloud native, or you leverage a tool that's more cloud agnostic that has some extra additional add-ins onto it, it makes it a lot easier. The installation would probably be handled for you, especially if it's in a native cloud provider. It's like a 2-second click of a button and you usually get a Kubernetes cluster up and running, and they pre-integrate all of the additional tools you need from their cloud provider, so you're not having to do all the heavy lifting. Now, what does get more complicated, and I briefly mentioned it before, regardless of what you do, is diagnosing a bug in application code. It really requires making sure that you're doing something like monitoring your applications the appropriate way, with something like a log analytics tool like Logstash with the Elasticsearch stack, or in most instances FluentD with Elasticsearch because of the way it grabs stuff natively. And then doing performance analysis with something like Sysdig or an Instana or some kind of an application monitoring solution that can aggregate all of the data from all your running pods. Because once your app starts scaling up, it's going to become untenable to try and do it manually like you maybe were able to do in the past. Now application performance and metric performance monitoring really become quintessential to operating in the environment.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I'm pretty much 100% in agreement there. I don't think that I think that it's inherently requires a little bit of a learning curve. I think, yeah, it's a fair assessment to say there's some complexity to it, especially I've seen a lot of complaints on the networking side, but these are with organizations, like you said, they're deploying inside their own data centers and having to do a lot of custom networking to get things to connect and talk to one another. But inherently, it is designed, in my opinion, I think it's designed for more use cases. It's flexible, it's infrastructure agnostic, but it's designed definitely to be more appropriate in distributed setup or definitely in a cloud environment. But a lot of the things that you brought up kind of bring me to another point I hear a lot of people talk about with Kubernetes, and this is definitely a hot debate. So would you, in that regard, would you call Kubernetes an orchestration platform? This is a kind of a two-parter. Why or why not would it be considered a platform? And what constitutes a platform for you?
I feel like it's a semantics game, right? Because I've called it an orchestration platform, but I guess it does depend on what you mean. What I mean when I say orchestration platform in this regard is that it is the platform for container orchestration, right? So it's what's doing the, hey, container A, you're going to go on node B. Hey, container C, you're going to go on node D. Oh, we have a storage solution. Let's connect these two things together. Oh, we have networking. We're going to network these things together. It does all that for you. So when I say orchestration platform, that's what I'm referring to, right? What other people argue is a platform is a more complete solution. And I would say that's the difference between having the engine of the car and the car itself, right? Now this is a great concept to go off of because you and I talk about cars sometimes. My car was built on the Miata platform, but it is not a Miata. I own a Fiat 124 Spider for those that are listening to this. And the reality is the car is built on the Miata platform because it uses more than the engine. It's a bunch of underlying components. Now, if we're talking about platform in regards to that, I would still say that Kubernetes is a platform. I would still say that, but some people would argue that a platform is more than just what Kubernetes is applying. Some people would argue that by saying platform, you're insinuating that everything you need to do the job of using a container in Kubernetes is given to you out of the box, meaning log aggregation is there for you, meaning Prometheus is there for you from a monitoring standpoint, meaning that storage is handled for you, that all the different things you're going to require during the application build lifecycle are there and ready for you out the gate. And if that's what you're going off of, then it's not a platform, it's the engine at that point. Does that make sense?
I would fall into that second part of that answer there is that for me, taking a look at the Cloud Native Foundation, Kubernetes does a lot for itself outside of the box. But for me, if I was a user setting it up in my organization and getting ready to set it up for a production environment, out of the box, it doesn't do enough of all the functions that I need it to do. And so like I would need more, or probably more third-party, plugins or tooling to get it to a place where I would feel comfortable leveraging it in a production environment from a monitoring and logging standpoint, from the ability to provide security, the ability to, even just image streams for the containers themselves. There's a host of other features that would just be needed to be included for me to be able to be comfortable with just leveraging a solution. And that to me seems like one of the tougher hills for Kubernetes to climb with some organizations that are more used to these comprehensive, out of the box, off the shelf solutions that do everything for them and make it easy. The other thing comes down to management. Some people are really comfortable with DIY and building it yourself, and building these custom works perfectly for us solutions. And I think that's wonderful. It's one of the benefits, right, of open source software to some degree, is not only availability, but the ability for organizations to customize and piece together those pieces of software in a way that works specifically for them at low to no cost. But I think there's a couple more points I want to make before moving on. This is definitely a good pin to put in that thought for a couple moments, but I want to go back to some of the elements we were talking about earlier with immutable infrastructure and infrastructure modernization. So things like Ansible and Terraform have become very popular from an infrastructure provisioning and management standpoint, and especially more organizations moving towards an immutable infrastructure kind of strategy. Do you think that that's influenced some of the adoption or added momentum to the adoption around containers and Kubernetes?
I think the two aren't necessarily related. I think they're happening at the same time. I think what gives itself the increased adoption of Terraform and Ansible, especially Ansible, is its simplicity compared to other traditional configuration systems, as well as its ability to do so many different things. Like, it is the Swiss Army knife of tools, so to speak. You can deploy infrastructure with it. You can talk to REST APIs with it. You can configure an OS with it. You can do so much with it. And it's so easy to read, so easy to adopt. And the biggest thing that companies run into with something like that is like, if I have attrition in my company, if people leave, how long is it going to take someone to go through this and figure out what it did and be able to learn how to use it, especially if they don't have a background in it? And Ansible has made it really, really, really easy to pick up and learn and to pick up and adopt, even if you weren't the originator of what was built. So I think because of that, that's what's increased the adoption there. Now, do I think the adoption of Ansible, though, lends itself to Kubernetes? I think it's helpful because I think what's going to happen with Kubernetes for most organizations, and what we've seen happen, is that most organizations are doing some things in Kubernetes, their application stacks, right? And then traditional infrastructure is staying the way it was, but they want to marry those paradigms. They don't want to do configuration management on one side of the stack and then immutable infrastructure on the other side of the stack. They want everything to feel and look the same. So they use either a combination of Terraform and Ansible or straight Ansible with something like Packer to create immutable images for their operating systems, such that even the stuff that's not living in Kubernetes looks and feels like a container image, because at this point it's a virtual machine image that we're printing out, essentially, more or less. So the paradigms for building your infrastructure marry themselves to the same type of orchestration. But at the end of the day, do I think the two outside of that are tied to each other? Not really. I just think that organizations tend to want to go, we don't want to do two different things. Let's try and keep everything the same. And this is a way that you can easily marry the two objectives.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that definitely is revealing to me. I guess I assume they were a little more strongly correlated, but that explanation makes far more business sense to me. In that same vein, in regards to infrastructure, given that there's been a lockstep kind of adoption of cloud technologies as Kubernetes has gained more momentum within the market, do you feel like that's connected at all to enabling further adoption, use, or even innovation of Kubernetes? And further beyond that, do you feel like cloud technology as an infrastructure base for organizations is the future?
That's kind of two different questions. So the first part, you're more or less asking, do I feel like the cloud making it easier, more or less, has made the rise of Kubernetes happen faster?
Yeah.
Right? So I would say to that, yes, to a degree. I think what it does is it allows people to whet their appetite faster. But it could be negative and positive, right? This is the way I look at it. The positive benefit is more people than ever can try Kubernetes without ever having experience with it, because you can press a button and have it spun out for you in like 3 or 4 minutes. The downside to it is that the tools that you marry to it aren't natively agnostic to Kubernetes as a platform, which means they're cloud specific. So if an organization, and many organizations I've seen do this, are testing out multiple cloud providers, and you have different teams testing out different Kubernetes platforms, AKS in one and EKS in another and GKE in the third, there ends up being an argument over which one's the best. And that argument can put an organization at a standstill of which one are they going to marry themselves to. So I think in some ways it's beneficial because it gets people's appetite wet, it gets them in the door. But in regards to making it stickier in an organization where they're going to go, well, how do we do this the same way across all cloud platforms so that way we feel like we're arguing apples to apples and not apples to oranges? I think that it could overcomplicate the conversation, at least to somewhat of a degree.
I got you.
And what was the second part of the question? I don't remember the second question.
Fine. It was kind of a big question, so I apologize.
No, you're fine.
Do you think that cloud technology is the future of where the market's going to be and organizations moving towards?
In regards to Kubernetes or general?
In general.
I think a lot of it depends on each organization. I think what we're going to see, especially given the crisis like we're going through right now, organizations are going to want to offload the management of the infrastructure themselves to some company that automates the recreation of infrastructure resources if they go down, and also that helps maintain it with kind of like the 5-9 rules. I think Amazon's actually larger than that. I think it's like the 7-9 or whatever now. And what I'm talking about is we're up 99.999999999% of the time, right? I think in situations like we're in now, this is going to drive companies to think further about risk mitigation. Are we ever going to run into situations like this again, whether it be from a virus or something else? We want to be prepared. And ultimately, I think organizations most of the time are not focused around being an infrastructure company. They're more focused around whatever they're trying to sell as a service. I'll give you an example. Domino's doesn't see themselves as an IT company, but something like 70% of their staff is somehow related to IT because they know that delivery of their product is going to become easier to do and better to track if they start becoming a logistics company and automating all the way they do their business through cloud providers and through the usage of different things. And now I'm going off of what news resources say. I don't work with Domino's, but that's just what I'm seeing come out of news resources. So using that as a clear-cut example, I feel like we're running into a situation now where more and more organizations are going to go, what's most important to my customer? Me running my infrastructure or me offloading that cost to an OpEx type cost and then changing the way I run business where ultimately most of my personnel are software developers that are building out new features for my customers or data scientists doing the analysis on the data itself.
Okay. Well, that makes sense to me. And it really kind of brings up another point in my head around how organizations are building themselves around this. They're kind of removing the importance of them, like you said, not being an infrastructure first company in terms of mind, but more of a service delivery forward thinking focus. So in that regard, do you feel like infrastructure agnosticity is important? Because in my opinion, I think it's critical.
Do you mean being cloud agnostic, or do you mean being agnostic to any kind of infrastructure? What do you mean specifically?
Like agnostic to like any style infrastructure, whether that be bare metal on-prem to being deployed into a cloud. I feel like technologies like critical or mission critical technologies like Kubernetes in this instance, right? I feel like it's important to being a truly agile and responsive business. Given today's environment, like some of the examples you're using with Domino's, right? If they needed to spin up on Azure or AWS in an emergency, having something like Kubernetes has that kind of that flexibility, right? To not care about the underlying infrastructure and just being able to deploy and be provisioned on that infrastructure without any sort of concern, for what specifically is underneath the hood. It does a lot of the
I think what you're highlighting is a problem that a lot of companies are considering. But I think the bigger problem, and it would solve both of these problems really, is not which infrastructure am I going to live on? It's what's the infrastructure is my developer is using versus what's the infrastructure that the actual deployment team is using, right? I need to be able to get from where my developer is building his stuff to production without hiccups. So when we have to make a change because some crash happened overnight and someone made a new code change, we're not spending hours, days, weeks trying to get that code into production. I need to make that lifecycle jump as easy as possible. And that's not even a Kubernetes argument. That's a containers argument, right? How do I containerize my workload such that my developer keeps all of his development workload, all of his code inside of a container, and I can pick that container up and drop it into any infrastructure I want. And that's how you solve that problem. Once everything is containerized, you not only can you go from any development environment to the production environment, but you can go from one infrastructure provider to another. Now, that doesn't lend itself necessarily to being full on cloud native, which I would say is more about leveraging things like functions as a service models and being embedded more tightly with a cloud provider to save more cost. But this allows you ultimately to be able to jump from dev to QA to prod across multiple prod environments, across multiple vendors rather easily.
Yeah, I agree. I think you did a much better job of forming that thought and the question for me there. Absolutely. I think that from the developer to operational standpoint is a perfect example where infrastructure agnosticity is important. And that's where we really highlight the benefits of containers in that regard, right? You can pick up a developer's application and really land it on any infrastructure without them having to be concerned about that. And so, going back to a previous point that we had around Kubernetes being that kind of complete solution for other people, and then in my opinion, and I think I can speak for you on this now, in your opinion, it not being like a total solution, more of like this really awesome engine that you can build something around. With that, what would I'm trying to think of a way to form this question appropriately. Um, what would be kind of like your Kubernetes platform of choice then, if there's a more complete solution out there? Because I have one in mind specifically, but I'd love to hear your opinion. If you feel there's a more comprehensive Kubernetes based solution out there, what do you think it is? And what do you think is one that makes the most sense given kind of how we've seen the market develop?
I think that there's a lot of solutions that are coming out right now that arguably fall into the same space. I think the biggest things you want to do is you want to standardize on tools that can be used across any platform and leverage operators where it makes sense. So there's, operators for monitoring now using the F stack, Elasticsearch, Fluentd, Kibana. There's ones for using Prometheus for doing a metric monitoring perspective. There's different tools you can leverage for different things. As for a package solution, calling out anything by name, I think, is a little bit shotgunny for me. But if I were going to label anything that uses kind of the default native narrative that I would say makes the most sense, it's probably OpenShift, just from a simple perspective. And I'm talking about Red Hat OpenShift for people that are watching. But just for the simple perspective that they're the main contributor to Kubernetes now. As it stands right now, they're the ones that are mainly contributing to the code base. And ultimately, they pre-package a bunch of the operators that are supposed to be hooked up and allow you to do Kubernetes updates that are live updated across different cloud providers, so you can have multi-clusters talk to each other. And I'm assuming that's what you're leaning at, but I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
So you would say that these are some of the things that makes that I'm of the same opinion too. Like if I had to pick a more comprehensive or platformized solution around Kubernetes, it would definitely be OpenShift for me for a number of reasons. But in your opinion, these are what I want to hear is what makes OpenShift different from Kubernetes. You're going definitely in that direction. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, from a tooling perspective, what it's more about than anything else, and I'll just say this regardless of OpenShift, this is about Kubernetes in general. This is the problem when people are saying, is it a platform or is it an engine, right? There's just things that are left to be seen when you're using just Kubernetes. It's like having the engine to a car without having the rest of the car fully baked. So how are you going to drive it? Right. So the fact of the matter is, when you leverage something that's pre-baked, you usually are going to get something like your log monitoring pre-baked. You're going to get some kind of a storage subsystem pre-baked into it. There's things that you got to look out for. And part of it is not only what am I using to help make my Kubernetes instance run more efficiently and be able to detect when there's issues, yada, yada, yada. But some of it's like, when I go to deploy something on it, how do I know that the containers that are running are certified and safe? How do I know that the platforms that I'm using are going to be able to assist me in such a way that I can get support not only for the platform as a whole, but for the application stacks that run on Kubernetes itself? And Red Hat does a really good job of saying, like, look, not only are we the ones building Kubernetes, we're adding these other additional packs, is what I would call them essentially, to give you the full robust feature set you need to be able to maintain and manage it inside of a live environment. But they can also support you from a lot of different angles in regards to what applications are being deployed inside of it, whether it be a messaging broker like Red Hat AMQ, or whether you're using a Java application suite. Like if you wanted to use Spring Boot, they'll support you with their application stack. So I mean, they not only support the platform, but they support just the applications as well. Whereas if you go out into the wild and go, hey, I'm going to use Kubernetes on AWS, for example, you can install operators there. You can leverage, the tooling that AWS natively provides, but how are you going to make sure that the applications that are deployed there are supported? And that becomes a separate question that then you have to deal with outside of that original conversation of what Kubernetes instance you're going to sign up for. So I think there's just a natural good fit story for when you want to develop something on Kubernetes. Not only do you have the tools there, but you have the support there too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm always focused around, again, it pushes me more towards the OpenShift direction than just, vanilla Kubernetes, are some of the drivers where it makes more sense, right, for organizations. For instance, Not everybody is as CLI native as the person that they sit next to, and things in OpenShift where they've simplified and improved that CLI experience for users, really helps with adopting containers and also something like Kubernetes with their teams. And then other things that OpenShift does well, in my opinion, over Kubernetes too, is another driver is if you have, again, a distributed infrastructure where you're having multiple clusters you have to manage in hybrid environments. That's something that OpenShift just does better from a platform standpoint. I think other things too are just the number of out of the box plugins and integrations that are available to you that Red Hat has included. Again, speaking about Red Hat OpenShift, folks, and Core OS are things that are just natively beneficial. So for me, where would you feel OpenShift makes the most sense for organization? Like what do you think the drivers, like why would you choose it if you were an organization, if you had a choice between Kubernetes and OpenShift? I think you've answered a lot of this question, but I just want to make sure we get that kind of more established.
I think it's a little bit of a loaded question. And what I mean by that is I think that arbitrarily speaking, that companies are going to decide to choose what they want to choose based on what fits and works for them. In regards to where OpenShift makes sense, I think it's more about if you're going to do a multi-cloud strategy, you should be leveraging a tool like OpenShift. If you're going to be going down the rabbit hole of using any kind of Java application platform, you should probably be using OpenShift just because of the fact that Red Hat's going to have support available for you for the underlying applications that you're going to be leveraging and the underlying frameworks you're going to be using. If you're concerned about your security footprint, and I mean that in regards to, and most people should be concerned about the security footprint, but if they're concerned about are the images being third-party tested for validity? Like if you're pulling images out of Docker Hub and throwing them into your cluster, you're more than likely going to have a security vulnerability at some point because you're not paying attention if all you're looking for is, does the application run in a root container? Yeah, that's important to look for, but there's other things to care about too. Are the packages vulnerable? Are there other things you have to be aware of? So if you're looking for something that's going to be safe, that's going to work across multiple cloud platforms, that's super easy to install at this point, and that can hypothetically work not only, I shouldn't say hypothetically, but can literally work not only in the cloud, but also straddle your hybrid environment by working on premise, then it's kind of a no-brainer at that point because there's nobody else that's really a player in town besides rolling your own. And rolling your own Kubernetes, as we said before, you got to take care of all the extra stuff that cloud providers are going to provide for you. So I think most organizations, and this is the reality of it, are not full-on cloud embedded. Most organizations are using some footprint in one, some footprint in the other, and it still have a ton of footprint on-prem. And any of those hybrid situations, you need a tool like OpenShift. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where you're changing the way you work with your tool in each environment, and you're going to have different people monitoring and mentoring the different resources inside of those groups. It's just going to become a logistic nightmare for an organization. And again, we don't care about being an infrastructure company like most people do. What people care about at the end of the day is what service are they delivering to their customer. So limit the footprint of things you have to care about by using one tool.
Which is exactly why I see the same thing, week over week with customers is that, the reality is that most folks aren't leveraging a singular cloud provider. Most of their infrastructure isn't in the cloud yet. There's a litany of reasons why that is the case, which we probably don't have the time to go into every single one specifically today. But it definitely makes sense why, you would leverage something like OpenShift over something like EKS or AKS. Because if you have a distributed setup, which we're seeing more commonly in the reality of the situation, you wouldn't leverage a cloud provider managed service like that, even despite the ease of use. It just goes back to your point about, those being specific to those cloud providers and the tools that they integrate with and the infrastructure at a base level. Like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, that's why I feel like you would choose OpenShift over those tools. Now, if there's a reason why you wouldn't, I'd love to hear that. But I think the only reason why you wouldn't would be, again, if you were on a singular cloud provider, you're all in on AWS, you're all in on Azure.
Yeah, if you're all in on one platform, like there are companies that have started from the ground up instead of AWS, especially out in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco. There's a lot of organizations. Netflix, for an example, has traditionally been an entire AWS shop. If you're that kind of in a company and you're going to use their native tooling, it makes a lot of sense. Now, there are situations still, even in those instances, where you might want to leverage something else like OpenShift, because there are features that don't get included even if you go after a bundled solution like a cloud provider has. You don't get integrated developer tools. You're not going to get a web interface. I mean, you get a web interface, don't get me wrong, for managing the cluster, but you don't get a web interface from like a development perspective of like, how do I manage my project space? And then how do I manage the kind of CI/CD nature of that? But at the same time, AWS is a series of tools you can use to do different myriads of things. And there are weights and balances in different situations. That's why I typically see the hybrid cloud is like it's the golden child for where this makes sense. It also is the golden child in regards to, again, if you want to make sure your applications are in secured containers. Now, could you go out and buy a third-party tool like Sysdig or Twistlock and go, hey, let me check to see if my containers are secure? Sure, but you're not going to have containers built for you that are natively secured, right? So that means after you go, oh crap, I'm using a vulnerable package in this container image. Well, that only tells you a package is vulnerable. It doesn't tell you that, what's wrong with the code base? Has it been written well? Is it vulnerable to SQL injection, cross-site scripting, all this other stuff? Is there stack level vulnerabilities? It doesn't tell you that. It just tells you, hey, we know that this package is vulnerable. Whereas if you have a certified image from a Red Hat provider, just as an example, you're going to be able to go, well, at the end of the day, they're guaranteeing me to a certain degree that this image is safe to use in their platform. And even if it's not safe, for some reason, they're going to support me if something goes wrong. And they're going to take care of it if something goes wrong. Like that's their job.
You're saying also from a security and compliance perspective too.
Well, I'm saying you're offloading risk. Yeah.
And I think that's a huge initiative for companies adopting enterprise technology like this, like in this instance, like Red Hat OpenShift, is because of the compliance and liability standpoint they face every day. I mean, we live in a world where, data breaches are unfortunately more commonplace than we'd like. And for some organizations are catastrophic, not only in a fines and fees standpoint, but from a legal culpability standpoint can provide, even jail time for certain individuals. So having something that is an additive factor to the security, removes more liability off of the company and more onto the technology provider, I think are things that are attractive to organizations as we move forward, especially into a more technology native culture.
Well, especially because you're alerted additionally when something like a new security vulnerability comes out or something is operated in regards to, hey, this package we know is vulnerable. Red Hat alerts you to that if you're using something like Access Insights, and they auto allow you to update your container images that are running. So, I mean, again, you're offloading risk. And that's one of the biggest things. If you have a CISO that's going to be involved in this conversation regarding Kubernetes and the cloud strategy at all, which if you have a CISO and they're not involved in your cloud strategy, that's probably already a red flag because they're going to be involved sooner rather than later, or they should be. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where something happens and then your CISO is going to flip out and try and own you for not taking his opinion into consideration when adopting certain things.
Yeah. And that it kind of goes, given that we're talking about kind of the current state of affairs when it comes to our, technology society and some of the things organizations face, with going to one of the current events that you brought up, which is, this coronavirus outbreak that we're facing right now, and some of the unique challenges it's caused organizations and other companies to face in regards to a distributed or remote workforce, and customer service. I mean, telemedicine even is something that is in my experience right now. I have to see all my doctors and everything virtually. I'm not allowed to go to the office. So there's a lot of other tools and services they leverage, and providers they leverage along with that too, that go into making all of these things work. So do you think, in this regard, going back to us talking about customer consumption, and the amount of bandwidth and horizontal scaling that's required to handle these types of issues, like for instance, that's video chatting. With the distributed workforce, that can provide some pretty significant strain. Do you think that Kubernetes could be a front runner solution or front runner part of that solution, helping solve these problems that organizations are facing right now?
I think to say it's the solution is a stretch.
Not it is,
but
a major part of
right. But to say that we're having an issue, we're worried about how are things going to sustain themselves automatically. I think it's part of the conversation. You need to be thinking about orchestration in general as it relates to self-healing, because self-healing, even in Kubernetes, only works as well as the structure by which you've built your microservice environment. If your microservices aren't built to keep running when a service goes down and it, for a certain amount of time and then comes back up, you're going to have a bad day regardless. So it's part of the conversation. Sure, it's not the answer to the conversation, but I think ultimately what we're realizing now is that even site reliability engineers and people that are involved in, dealing with these situations from a response perspective, they're not always going to be around and be able to access your environment. If, for example, your VPN goes down for some reason, how can we build our systems to be as robust as possible to try and hold the ship together until the person can get finally back into the system and figure out what's wrong? So Kubernetes, I think, is going to be a part of the conversation, and orchestration in general will be, again, as it relates to self-healing infrastructure and what ultimately we can do to prevent things from getting too chaotic when these situations occur. So I think people after this, if anything, should be thinking a lot about this. They should be thinking about chaos engineering in general, how organizations like Netflix generally operate and how they're able to sustain themselves in terms of outages. This is also where I think multi-cloud strategies are going to become really relevant, because we're going to be thinking about what if Microsoft's data centers go out because they can't have anybody go into the data centers because there was someone who went in there that was sick or something negative happened to that building. Well, now I need to be replicated in multiple data centers, or I want to be replicated across multiple cloud providers, depending on what I'm trying to be fault tolerant of.
Yeah. No, like I said, I think in my opinion, it's definitely a major part of the conversation and maybe even the solution for, addressing some of these challenges. It's definitely, like you said, going to be at the forefront of everyone's minds as we come out of this, current situation. I can think of a couple examples where I've seen some issues with, let's say, a major, I won't name any names, but like a major candle, soap, and body products company. I think we're all pretty familiar. You've probably seen them in the mall before. Everyone likes to go smell all their candles. They have like 1,000 of them. Has had to move their entirety of their business online because all their stores are closed. And there's been some struggle with managing the influx of folks that have, traversed to their app or their website to handle that type of e-commerce surge. So I think that's definitely something that they're probably going to be addressing. It won't be the complete solution, but it'll definitely be something they're looking towards, in my mind, is something to kind of heal these ailments that they have with learning to live in an environment like this, where we could see prolonged or protracted challenges like this over the next year and a half. I think that brings me to another point. Now that we're talking about how organizations are looking at the future and handling this, current situation, but more in regards to container technology and Kubernetes, where would you like to see that go in the future for you?
That's such a broad question. Jeez.
Yeah, it's about as wide open field as we can get there.
Where do I want to
be like your canvas? If you had semi-realistic dream sheet of where you'd like to see these things go. And it could be one specific thing. It could be many. I'm not of any concern there. I just would love to hear your opinion of what you think the future should look like.
I'm thinking about it now. This is what I'll say, just to go into the art of possible for a second. There's been a lot of interesting things that have been built over the last 10 years as it relates to monitoring, right? And I'm not using monitoring to say I want to see monitoring get better. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I've seen come out of monitoring is the way that we do things like bytecode injection for detecting issues from a performance perspective in things like Java and C# based applications. I think what I would like to see is the growth of more prevalent standards across languages, so that way we could do things from a bytecode injection or an injection standpoint that are similar to this, but not for the purposes of doing performance improvement. And this takes a little bit of a development mindset, but like if you're a developer, even if you build a stateful application, you're leveraging typically native libraries in regards to Java or C# for doing things like session management and whatnot. It would be interesting to see auto injection frameworks get to the point where you don't even have to think about doing things like data caching for it to handle a lot of it for you. Not for the advanced level developers, but for some of these organizations where they've traditionally had these monolithic apps, to be able to almost self-transform as a bandage to let them be able to horizontally scale for the temporary near term while they fix their systems. I think that would be really cool. I think it's a stretch. It's a massive stretch, but I think it's possible. I also think in the same art of possible, we've seen some things pop up like, what's it called? Flyway DB. Which is used to do database version controlling. So that way, if your database version changes behind an application between a blue-green deployment or, the changing of one deployment version to another, so to speak, that we end up in a situation where it can understand both versions of the database and communicate with it separately depending on what version it's using. It would be cool to see some of those things get natively built in, because what I see people having as the hardest problem is not setting up Kubernetes, which is becoming easier and easier and easier. It's not setting up the tools, which becomes easier and easier and easier. It's the re-architecting and rewriting of their application stacks to take advantage of these platforms that are in front of them. So how much of that can we automate away from the end user? And that was a long-winded way to say that, but I was kind of figuring it out as I was going.
I think especially for our developers that are tuning in, this is very interesting. I'm sure some of them echo a lot of the same dream sheets or desires there. It sounds an awful lot like what you're asking for too is more standardization and frameworks we can develop within that are more Kubernetes or container native. So things like Quarkus, for instance, like a Java framework that's designed specifically to work in Kubernetes and is tailored towards containers. Having more standardization within the languages, especially ones that have to be, they're static and compiled, like you said, like C# or Java, will require us to have more go forward frameworks that are standardized for people to use, for them to maximize the benefits here and not lead to any development headaches or having to recover old ground in order to get ahead. Am I tracking you on that, or? Well,
to a degree, but something like Quarkus you'd have to implement now, right? I'm talking about there's standards that have already pre-existed as well. The JE spec, for example, in Java. I have a huge Java background, so I lean on that first. But what I would say is, if we could leverage something like bytecode injection to automatically handle the transition of some traditional standards that were leveraged for years and years and years to be able to, kind of jump our hurdle, so to speak, and get us to a point where we're already somewhat cloud native or somewhat microservice enabled, I think we would be having a much better start to making that journey. Right? Because I think a lot of times what people are going through right now is they've a lot of developers like, hey, I've been working in this industry for the last 12 years. Yeah, I know what containers are. I've been building monolithic server apps for the last, 7 of those 12 years or whatever. And I need to know what I need to change in order to make this work in this new world. And that takes a lot of time and energy, not only to learn the new tools, but to start interacting with them and bring them into your system. If we could somehow take the tools we previously built, and again, this is a panacea. You asked for a wish list item, so I'm giving it to you. If we could take the tools that previously were built, the old versions of the JE framework, even go back to say the JDK 1.7 or 1.8. 1.8 I think is still supported. I don't think 1.7 is. But if we go back to JDK 8 and go, hey, all the standards in there, we're going to port them so that way whenever you leverage sessions, that they're auto-shared without you having to do anything. Like some of this already kind of exists with Infinispan and whatnot, but you have to still implement Infinispan underneath the hood of your app server. If the orchestration platform itself could take care of some of that automatically, I think some of the hurdles of adoption could go down. But it's a very complicated problem because there's so many languages people are leveraging. There's so many new languages that are coming out, like Go and Angular and all these kind of JavaScript-like languages that people are leveraging. And who knows where to start with all this? Where would you even, would you target Java? Would you just say, most workloads in Kubernetes aren't even Java related. They're really more node related. Who knows? And I'm rambling a little bit. My point though is I think there's a lot of different things we could hope and wish for. I think what we got now is pretty good and it lends itself well to what we're going to be aiming for. But ultimately we need to be thinking about what are the things that we have to take into consideration once our apps get in there, and how can we improve that transition to some degree so that way we're not having to rewrite from the ground up and we can do more of a transitional cycle from what we have to what will be.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of things people could put on the sheet here, and wholly agree with what we have now is pretty incredible and very capable. Going to your comment about the world that we live in and where it's going, given the advent of us moving into, the maturity of AI and, machine learning, and as well as big data, being around for almost 2 decades now, nearly, and definitely coming into maturity in terms of its application, I'm seeing more and more use cases now in the market where Kubernetes or OpenShift are being leveraged as a solution or technology, core component in these applications. Why do you think things like container orchestration or container orchestration platforms like OpenShift, for instance, are being leveraged in machine learning and big data applications?
Well, because it has to do with high performance compute, right? Like when you're trying to perform high computational, functions around large data sets, you're going to rapidly want to scale up those processing engines to be able to handle as much data crunch as you can for the time being. And then the second you're done, especially if you're doing batch type processing, you're going to want to scale it right back down. Now, in terms of stream, the same thing kind of applies because sometimes your stream of data is going to be larger than others. And so you might want to expand out rapidly the number of processing engines to handle that stream temporarily until that funnel shrinks back down. And you want to remain cost competent, right? You're not going to be arbitrarily just throwing the kitchen sink at every request that's coming in. You want to be conscious of the fact that every computational cycle is costing you money. And there is a value to be gained, obviously, from doing data analytics on whatever it is you're crunching. But I'm sure not every time you analyze your data, you're going to get $1 of value out of it. Yeah, so there's a range by which you want to do this.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that when we look at, especially with big data and then being applied in a machine learning and AI leveraged that way, we can look at like the Internet of Things. That's another thing I keep seeing traction around where this market around containers and Kubernetes and so on really has a strong attraction to recently is the Internet of Things, and that being played into what we're talking about. So these edge cases, like running Kubernetes at the edge. One in particular use case comes to mind, which is Chick-fil-A, where they were deploying at the edge in their restaurants. And there was a couple of advantages. So, for them, it was low latency for a lot of the applications that need to be connected to the network. There was high availability for those applications too. But it also allows it to scale to demand, like we've talked about extensively, and innovating on like rapid innovations and iterations of the applications and services can be deployed and managed very quickly in that way. Do you think that in that regard, Kubernetes containers can really help, these edge technologies to help benefit businesses and even beyond that, maybe society?
Well, that's a big question. Society.
Society.
Maybe for the edge cases, sure. I mean, that's the reason why you want to leverage something that's kind of a more hybrid design tool, especially one that takes into consideration even older hardware. Like if customers are leveraging mainframes or whatnot, if you're using something like OpenShift, you can do it on premise. It's not a big deal, including on top of, old mainframe technology. So I think there's a benefit to be gained in that retrospect. It's possible to use it for that and it will make your life easier. It all just depends on your use case of what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's sometimes going to be beneficial and other times it's going to be throwing an elephant at a 2-pound problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely ways that it could be simplified and not have to be complex, and there's ways that it can be employed effectively and strategically. That really kind of ends it's my discussions around the more innovative components and directions that we see this technology moving in. And I think you definitely hit on a good point about security and security tools that surround these technologies and some of the concerns there. So I think we're pretty good. With that, I really don't have too many further questions. Thank you for all the information you'd be able to convey today around Kubernetes, containers, microservices, and even platforms like Red Hat OpenShift. I've learned a lot, and I hope some of the viewers at home today have also learned a lot regarding some of these technologies, how they're being employed, and some of the situations and use cases where they make sense. And some of the things that you can do as far as best practices to keep in mind moving forward if considering it. So, Derrick, do you have any questions for me or?
No, I'm good. Nothing that's glaring to me. Just stay safe.
Yeah, everyone, please stay safe out there. Again, I appreciate your time, Derrick. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and talk about this. Like I said, I found it extremely beneficial. So thank you.
You're welcome.